The waiting room at Lakeview Community Health Center smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer, and it had been running 40 minutes behind schedule when Ryan Donahue first noticed the man in the cashmere coat. Ryan sat in one of the orange plastic chairs near the window with his 9-year-old daughter Maeve pressed against his side, her purple winter boots swinging 2 inches above the floor. Outside, February snow came down in slow, indifferent sheets across the parking lot. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with the particular frequency Ryan associated with bad news and long waits. The same sound that had filled the oncology wing 3 winters ago, the last time he had sat in a room like this and tried to look calm for someone he loved. He had already been there an hour. He had brought a book for Maeve and forgotten to bring anything for himself, so he sat with his hands loose on his knees, still wearing his work vest with the Donahue mechanical logo on the chest, a fresh mark near the collar from the boiler job he'd rushed to finish before school pickup. The man in the cashmere coat stood near the intake desk. Ryan noticed him the way you noticed a sound that didn't fit the room. Every other person in that waiting area was quiet, patient, bundled against the cold that had followed them in from outside. But this man carried a different kind of stillness, the kind that came from expecting the space to arrange itself around him. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, silver at the temples, the sort of expensive haircut that looked effortless and wasn't. He held a phone in one hand and a leather folder in the other, and he was speaking to the woman behind the intake desk in a voice just low enough that the words didn't carry, but the tone did. The woman's name tag said Nadine. She had dark hair pulled back simply and wore the pale green scrubs most of the clinic staff wore. She'd been the one who checked Maeve in when they arrived, and Ryan had noticed then the way she moved. Measured, unhurried, the kind of calm that held a room steady when a room needed holding. She had given Maeve a sticker of a cartoon moose, without being asked, and told her seriously that it was a very important sticker. Now that same woman stood with her shoulders drawn in, her chin slightly lowered, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. Ryan watched. The man whose name Ryan would later learn was Conrad Stiles leaned forward and set his leather folder on the desk with a sound like punctuation. The woman behind the desk flinched. Just barely. Just enough. "I don't want to hear about the system," Conrad said, his voice rising now just enough to reach the nearest chairs. "I want to hear about why a priority referral for a client of mine has been sitting in your queue for 11 days while your staff apparently can't manage basic intake processing." Nadine spoke quietly. Ryan couldn't hear the words. Conrad could. He didn't like them. "That's not an explanation. That's an excuse dressed up in medical language." A few people in the waiting room shifted. One older man near the magazine rack folded his newspaper and watched. Maeve had stopped swinging her boots. "Dad," she said very quietly. Ryan put a hand on her knee. He was watching Nadine's face, the way she nodded once, apologized in a tone that cost her something to produce, then turned to reach for a binder on the shelf behind her. It was the movement of someone who had learned to make themselves small. Conrad watched her do it and let the silence sit there like pressure. Then he said, loud enough for the whole room, "I genuinely don't understand how someone as disorganized as you keeps a position like this." Nadine froze. Ryan stood up. He didn't make a decision, exactly. The decision had already been made for him somewhere around the age of 8, the first time he'd watched his father stand between a contractor and a woman who couldn't pay her heating bill and told the contractor to leave. Some lessons didn't need to be taught twice. He crossed the waiting room in 8 steps. Conrad turned at the sound of boots on the linoleum, taking in the work vest, the grease stain, the fact that Ryan had at least 2 inches and 20 pounds on him, and visibly deciding none of it mattered. "Can I help you with something?" Conrad asked. "She's already helping you," Ryan said. "The way she's doing it is fine." Conrad's expression didn't change. "This is a private conversation. You're having it in a room full of people." A beat of silence. Nadine had gone very still. Conrad looked at Ryan with the specific patience of someone who expected the other person to remember their place. "I suggest," Conrad said, "you sit back down. And I suggest you lower your voice." It wasn't dramatic. Ryan didn't raise his own voice. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, and waited. Conrad searched his face for something to work with. Anger, perhaps, or the kind of aggression that could be used later, and didn't find it. What he found instead was stillness, and stillness was harder to dismiss. Conrad smiled, thin and cold. "You have no idea who you're speaking to. You're speaking to a clinic receptionist like she's a problem you stepped in. That's enough for me to know." Behind the desk, Nadine looked up. Something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, but something more careful than that, attentive. as if she were noting something down. Conrad set his leather folder on the desk a second time, more deliberately. I oversee healthcare services contracts for 11 facilities in this region. This clinic processes reimbursements through my office. He let that sit. So perhaps you'd like to reconsider the tone you're taking with me. Ryan didn't move. The tone's fine. Conrad turned half back toward Nadine, then stopped. He pulled out his phone, dialed, and spoke with his back half turned to Ryan, but his voice fully audible. Get me the service file on Donahue Mechanical. Yes. Tell me what contracts they hold with our managed properties. A pause. All of them. He ended the call, turned back. You service the HVAC systems in 2 of our managed buildings, Hillcroft Center and the Westbrook Annex. Ryan said nothing. Past tense, as of this afternoon. Maeve had come to stand near Ryan's elbow without him hearing her move. She was looking up at Conrad with the wide, cataloging eyes of a child who understood more than adults like to believe. That's not fair, she said. Conrad looked down at her with something between surprise and contempt. Ryan moved a half step in front of her, not quickly, but completely. Go sit down, sweetheart, Ryan said. His voice was even. Maeve held his gaze for a second, then went. Conrad watched her go. You should have thought about her before you inserted yourself into something that had nothing to do with you. Nadine spoke from behind the desk. Her voice had changed, quieter but precise. Mr. Stiles, I'll have the referral processed and on your assistant's desk within the hour. Conrad looked at her. See that you do. He gathered his folder, nodded at the room the way men who expect gratitude for leaving sometimes do, and walked toward the exit. The bell above the clinic door rang once as it swung shut. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the older man near the magazine rack set his newspaper down slowly, and 2 women in the corner resumed their conversation in lower voices than before. Nadine came around from behind the desk and crouched in front of Maeve, who had returned to her chair. The moose sticker is still important, Nadine said. Maeve considered this. He was really mean. He was. My dad gets that face when people are mean. Maeve nodded toward Ryan, the quiet one. Nadine stood and looked at Ryan. There was something in her gaze that didn't match the green scrubs or the tired clinic lighting. A sharpness, a calibration, like someone making measurements no one else in the room knew were being taken. Thank you, she said simply. He shouldn't talk to you like that. Nadine glanced toward the door. No, he shouldn't. A pause. He's going to make your afternoon difficult. Already started, Ryan almost smiled. More than you know, she said quietly, and there was something in how she said it that Ryan didn't understand until much later. He didn't sleep well. He never slept well anymore. Not since Helen, but that night was worse than usual. By 6 in the morning, he was at the kitchen table with the heating bills spread out in front of him and his phone face down on the counter because he already knew what it would show him when he turned it over. He turned it over at 6:15, 4 messages, 2 contract suspensions, Hillcroft, then Westbrook. One from a property management company he'd worked with for 3 years. We've been advised to pause all service agreements pending a conduct review. The 4th from a number he didn't recognize. We know what you did. Don't make it worse. Maeve padded into the kitchen at 7 in her socks and her bear-print pajamas, and Ryan turned the phone face down again. We're fine, he said before she asked. She looked at him. You made eggs. Yeah. You only make eggs when things are bad. He put a plate in front of her. She ate without saying anything else, which was somehow the most exhausting kindness she could have offered him. By 9 o'clock, his inbox held 2 more cancellations. By 9:30, a white van had driven past his house twice in 20 minutes. By 10, his phone showed a news alert from a local radio station's website. Tradesman threatens healthcare administrator at Lakeview Clinic. Patient care concerns raised. The story quoted an unnamed source within the clinic's management structure. It described Ryan as agitated and confrontational. There was a photo taken at an angle he didn't recognize from any moment he remembered, but it made him look rigid and hostile. He read it 3 times, each time feeling something colder settle in his chest. He was still staring at the screen when the rear window of his truck was sideswiped by something in the alley behind the house. Got there in time to see a dark sedan turning at the far end of the street. No plates visible. He stood in the cold alley for a long minute, breathing through his nose. He had learned in harder seasons how to stay steady when steadiness cost something. He stayed steady now. He was back inside on the phone trying to reach his insurance agent when a knock came at the front door. Nadine stood on his porch in a dark gray coat over dark jeans, her clinic ID badge gone, her hair down. She looked entirely different from the woman in green scrubs and entirely the same the same posture, the same quality of attention. "How did you get this address?" Ryan asked. "Your service truck is parked in front of your house. The company name is on the side." She glanced past him into the hallway. "I came to warn you." Little late for that, he stepped aside. She came in. She didn't sit when he gestured toward the kitchen table. She stood near the counter and set a folder down beside his phone. "Conrad Stiles doesn't stop at contract cancellations," she said. "He escalates until people stop being visible. He's done it to 4 other contractors in the last 2 years. 2 of them moved, 1 lost his house." Ryan folded his arms. "And you know this because?" "Because I've been tracking it." "Tracking it." He looked at her. "You're a clinic receptionist." "I was working as a clinic receptionist," a careful pause, "for the past 6 weeks. Something shifted in the room. Ryan waited. "My name is Nadine Pelletier." She said it without ceremony, like she was placing something heavy on the table. "I'm the chief operating officer of Northern Lakes Health Authority." The name landed the way a name like that does in a small region. Everyone knew Northern Lakes. It oversaw public health services across half the province. "You were auditing the clinic," he said, not a question. "Conrad Stiles manages the private contracts that run through our system. Internal reports suggested those contracts were being used to pressure small operators, manipulate referral queues, and suppress complaints from staff. I needed to see it without being seen." Ryan let out a slow breath, "And then I showed up." "And then you showed up." Something almost like warmth crossed her face, "And you were exactly what he needed to deflect attention." He looked at the folder she'd brought. "What's in there?" "Everything: lease diversions, suppressed audit flags, payments routed through vendor accounts to avoid review." She opened it and turned pages toward him. "Contracts canceled, people pressured, signed under Conrad's authorization." Ryan's eyes moved across the documents. He stopped at one page, a familiar letterhead, a familiar date. "What is this?" he asked, very quietly. Nadine's voice softened. "Ryan, this is a referral denial." He picked up the page. The patient name was Helen Donahue. "They told us it was delayed by administrative backlog. Nobody's fault. The system." He looked up. "This has Conrad's signature." Nadine didn't look away. "He implemented a cost reduction policy across all managed facilities. Oncology referrals under a certain insurance tier were queued differently. Not denied outright, just delayed long enough too." Long enough. Ryan set the page down. His hands were completely still, which he knew was the most dangerous version of himself. 11 weeks. That's how long it took to get approved. The doctor said those 11 weeks changed everything about the staging. Nadine was quiet. "I know." Ryan stood at his kitchen counter, looking at the papers. Outside, Maeve's school bus would be pulling up to the corner in 4 hours. He thought about her sitting across from him at breakfast, telling him he only made eggs when things were bad. "Tell me what happens next," he said. The board meeting at the Northern Lakes Health Authority offices occupied a room on the 7th floor of the provincial building downtown, with a long, polished table and 12 people in quiet, expensive clothes and the particular feeling that outcomes had been partially arranged before anyone sat down. Ryan wore the dark sport coat he'd bought for Maeve's school concert. It was clean and it fit, and that was what it was. Nadine walked in beside him, and the room recalibrated in a way he could feel without being able to fully see. 2 board members straightened. A woman near the window lowered her reading glasses. Conrad Stiles, already seated, looked up from his phone, and the expression on his face didn't disappear so much as recalculate. "Well," Conrad said with the ease of a man who had always controlled his exits, "I wasn't aware this was that kind of meeting." The board chair, a compact woman named Dr. Vera Whitson, looked at Conrad over her glasses. "Sit down, Conrad." Conrad's expression flickered. He sat. Nadine connected her tablet to the room's display without preamble. Documents filled the screen: lease diversions, suppressed complaints, referral queue manipulations, vendor reimbursements that traced to nothing legitimate. Conrad leaned back and folded his hands. "Strategic resource allocation. All of this falls under standard operational flexibility clauses." A board member near the door, a younger man who had been scribbling notes since they entered, looked up. "Can you walk us through the vendor payments? 3 of these companies don't appear to have any registered business addresses." Conrad's jaw tightened slightly. "That's a question for the accounts team. Your signature is on the approvals." Conrad didn't answer. Nadine advanced to the next document. 4 independent contractors were pressured following complaints against Mr. Stiles' office. In each case, contracts were canceled within 48 hours of the complaint being filed. She looked at the room. "Ryan Donahue is the 5th. His cancellation occurred within 4 hours of a public interaction in which he asked Mr. Stiles to speak respectfully to clinic staff. Several heads turned toward Ryan. He stood near the edge of the table, hands clasped in front of him, and waited. Conrad pivoted sharply. The man made a physical approach inside a healthcare facility. There are witnesses. There's a security camera, Nadine said, and pressed play. The footage was clear. Conrad's posture at the desk, his volume. Nadine's flinch, Ryan crossing the room slowly, standing still, saying nothing loud enough to alarm anyone, Maeve walking over without being called, and Ryan stepping in front of her. Conrad watched the screen with a face that had become very composed and very still. When it ended, Dr. Whitson removed her glasses entirely and set them on the table. Mr. Stiles, did you authorize surveillance on Mr. Donahue's home and vehicle? Conrad said nothing. We have the billing invoices, Nadine said. Security contractor invoiced to your office within the same 24-hour window. The younger board member had stopped scribbling. The woman near the window had turned in her chair to look directly at Conrad. Ryan had not intended to speak. He had agreed to be present as documentation, a face to put alongside the pattern of names in Nadine's file. But Dr. Whitson looked at him directly and said simply, Mr. Donahue, is there anything you'd like the board to hear? Ryan had spent 2 years after Helen died not saying the right things to the right people at the right time. Standing at insurance counters and administrative windows and understanding, slowly, that certain rooms had already made their decisions before he arrived. He had learned to read those rooms. He read this one now. He took a breath and said what was true. I don't have much to contribute about corporate governance. His voice was even. But I can tell you what it looks like from outside rooms like this one. He paused. My wife's name was Helen. 3 years ago, she was diagnosed, and we spent 11 weeks trying to get an oncology referral approved while she got worse. We were told it was the system. Backlog. Nobody's fault. He looked at Conrad. I just saw a document with your signature authorizing the policy that created that backlog, for patients in our insurance category. The room was completely still. I didn't come here for that, Ryan continued. I came because a man with authority used it to humiliate someone who couldn't respond, and when I asked him to stop, he spent the next 18 hours dismantling my livelihood and surveilling my house. He looked at Dr. Whitson. My daughter is 9. She watched all of it. I'd like her to grow up in a province where someone eventually notices that. Conrad broke his silence. This is entirely irrelevant too. Conrad, Dr. Whitson's voice was very quiet and very clear. Stop speaking. Conrad stopped. Nadine advanced to the final document on the screen. The healthcare policy Mr. Donahue referenced was implemented 12 years ago under Mr. Stiles' office. It affected referral timelines for approximately 300 patients in the region over 4 years before it was quietly revised. No public record of the revision, no notification to affected families. One board member covered his face with one hand. The board will be suspending Mr. Stiles' operational authority pending a full investigation, Dr. Whitson said. She looked toward the door where 2 security officers had appeared at some point Ryan hadn't noticed. Please escort Mr. Stiles out. Conrad stood slowly. He looked around the room the way men who have always been protected look around a room when protection withdraws, with the specific naked disbelief of someone who genuinely believed the world was arranged for their benefit. Then he straightened his coat and walked out, and the door closed and the room exhaled. Ryan stood at the window afterward, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the city lights come on below as the afternoon faded into a pale winter evening. Nadine came to stand beside him. The board will be reaching out to affected families, she said, including yours. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He thought about Helen, who had been practical and funny, and had once spent 3 hours on hold with an insurance company without raising her voice once. He thought about Maeve asking him at the breakfast table if they were okay. It won't undo anything, he said. No. He stopped, 11 weeks. I know, Nadine's voice was careful. I'm sorry. Ryan nodded once. He was not going to cry in a boardroom anteroom. That was a line he had drawn 3 years ago and kept. After a moment, Nadine held out an envelope. The health authority will be reinstating your service contracts. Both of them and the 3 additional facilities Conrad had flagged for removal. She paused. Dr. Whitson asked me to give you this personally. The board reviewed your maintenance records from the past 4 years. Apparently, your documentation is better than our own internal teams. Despite everything, a small, tired sound that was almost a laugh came out of Ryan. He took the envelope. You didn't have to come to my house this morning, he said. You didn't have to stand up yesterday. He looked at her. I have a 9-year-old who was watching. Nadine's expression softened, not sentimentally, but genuinely, in the way of someone who understood exactly what was being said. That's the best reason there is. Ryan drove back across the city in the dark snow, beginning again the kind of light snow that turned streetlights into halos and made the whole city look quieter than it was. He picked Maeve up from her after-school program 20 minutes late, and she came out with her backpack on both shoulders, and looked at him with the thorough, unsparing assessment of a person who had learned not to trust everything an adult's face said. "Are we still okay?" she asked. "We're better than okay," he said, and this time he meant it enough that she didn't push back. He took her to Tim Hortons because it was cold and she'd had a long day, even though she wouldn't call it that, and they sat in a booth by the window and she had a hot chocolate and he had a coffee. And she told him about a project she was doing at school about Canadian birds and the fact that the gray jay had been nominated as the national bird, and she personally thought this was a good choice, because gray jays were tough and quiet, and didn't make a big fuss about things. Ryan looked at his daughter across the table, her mittens set beside her cup, her nose still pink from the cold, telling him with perfect seriousness about the virtues of a bird that didn't make a big fuss. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's a good choice, too." Later, after Maeve was in bed and the house was quiet the way it had been quiet for 3 years, not empty exactly, but shaped differently than it used to be, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with the envelope Nadine had given him and a cup of tea that had gone cold. He thought about Helen. He thought about the waiting room and the fluorescent lights and the particular sound they made, and about all the rooms where decisions get made before you arrive, and about what it means to walk into one anyway. Outside, the snow was still coming down in slow, quiet sheets across the neighborhood. Inside, the house was warm, which was something he had built more or less with his own hands, and which was still standing. He put the envelope in the drawer beside the bills and the school drawings, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on Maeve. She was asleep with her arm around a stuffed moose that had been sitting on her shelf for years. He had forgotten it was there. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, long enough that the cold from the hallway settled around his feet. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet inside his house felt like something he had earned rather than something he was simply surviving.